Thank you so much, Dr. Maxim. Thank you also, Prof. Israeli, for hosting us, and Zvinka for the partnership with the Ukraine Society of South Africa. So I'm Tim Murithi with the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation here in Cape Town, and I commend this initiative that is going to lead to the publication of a number of policy briefs on these topics that we're discussing today. So I think what is clear is that no one should have their rights infringed upon. As human beings, we do have a responsibility to stand in solidarity with those who are suffering from the loss of their freedom. And in the case of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there are multiple contested narratives. There are some false narratives, political spin doctoring going on. So I think it is your responsibility as an individual to keep yourself informed about what is transpiring in that region and to act, to make a decision to act in any small way that you can. So I'll also focus on the issue of regional security. And Africa, we're quite familiar with the colonial conquest, the scramble for Africa, 1884, 85, and the occupation of our continent by European colonial powers. Then I'll look at the UN Charter and where we are in terms of the crisis of multilateralism that Prof. Israeli has mentioned, and maybe suggest some ways forward in terms of how we can transform our international system, particularly of collective security embodied in the UN Security Council. So I think Africa, it's clear we have endured the brutality of colonialism, the conquest and dominion and oppression. And our countries really only began to be free in the 1960s. And Zimbabwe was in the 1980s, South Africa in 94. And that's 30 years that's passed, but we're still dealing with the legacy of internal colonialism, land dispossession, and you can see the signs of this all around us, in fact, across South Africa. So we're very familiar with wars of colonial conquest. And I think as Africans, this should, enable us to even connect or at least understand the context that is playing out in Ukraine. And I believe that despite the multiple narratives, the selective narratives, and the false narrative, even fake news that is happening at the moment, we have to inform ourselves and also recognize that Ukraine was an independent state in 1945 when the United Nations was established. Many African freedom fighters, including South African freedom fighters, were trained in Ukraine, in Odessa, and in other parts of the country. As part of the Soviet Union, Ukraine supported many freedom movements on the African continent. But it's also true that the collapse of the Soviet Union led to the flooding of weapons across the African continent, and some of them did, in fact, come from Ukraine and other states in the region. But I think the point I'm trying to make is you need to keep yourself informed about this historical context to push back against the false narratives that are being spread out there. But what we have now, we've seen when the Russian invasion began on the 24th of February 2022, Russia was sitting as the president of the United Nations Security Council, and it was invading a fellow member state of the United Nations system. If you need a metaphor or a sign that the international system of collective security is broken, there you have it. And I would actually say that the system is functionally dead. The UN Security Council is a living dead organism. It doesn't really achieve very much. And it has become suffocated by the actions of powerful countries who are indiscriminately using the veto power to pursue their own selfish interests. And the system also excludes a majority of the world's population from international decision making. I think the members of the Permanent Five, US, France, UK, China, and Russia, constitutes about 1/3 of the world's population. So you've got 2/3 of the world's population really at the mercy of very hostile powers and forces. And it's time to rethink, I would argue, and remake the global order. Now, this does not mean throwing the UN baby out with the bathwater, but it does imagine reimagining multilateralism, redesigning institutions to create a more effective and inclusive global system of collective security. From an African perspective, this is an urgent task for us. More than 60% of the agenda of the UN Security Council focuses on the African continent. And yet no single African country has a permanent seat or permanent membership of the UN Security Council. And so in effect, we see a situation of injustice where African countries can only participate in deliberations and negotiations about their own future as spectators and bystanders. So the multilateral system, from an African perspective, is equally unfair, unjust, illegitimate, and the Security Council really has to be transformed. If you add this, the historical context of African countries barely being present in the formation of the United Nations in 1945, April to June, only 3 African countries were independent. Egypt, Ethiopia, Liberia, and South Africa was still under the yoke of apartheid, and so wasn't technically independent. And the small number of African countries present at the formation of the United Nations also gives us a strong case to push for the transformation of the United Nations system. So we have a crisis of multilateralism, but we do also have a window of opportunity. This year is the United Nations Summit of the Future, very grandiose in typical United Nations grandiosity. There is a Pact of the Future that has already been issued and it's been published, and you can download it and read it. Now, this Pact of the Future is not offering anything new. The Pact of the Future uses the word reaffirm 49 times. So the United Nations is very keen to reaffirm and so on and so forth. And the reason for this, it's an intergovernmental negotiation, and that document has been developed by the governments, the 193 governments, not the people. And I think we as the people have to find ways to insert ourselves into this process. And so this is it's a very opportune year for us to push the agenda of thinking outside the box, beyond the platitudes and the promises that the Summit of the Future proposes. It's not going to live up to the hype if we take the Pact of the Future as a guiding light. So the UN Charter has a provision within it which a lot of people are not familiar with, and I would encourage you to go and do some of your own research and look at Article 109 of the United Nations Charter, specifically paragraph 3, which speaks of the need for a general conference to review the United Nations Charter. This has been in that document since the founding of the UN, but in the 79-year history of the organization, the UN Charter has never been reviewed. There was an attempt in 1955, but it was sabotaged. So this is still on the cards. It's still something that can be done. There's a draft resolution that can be put on the table, and I think Ukraine, working collectively with African governments, can actually be part of the leading group of countries that put such a resolution on the table. President Zelensky of Ukraine has actually stated quite openly that he is very keen to see a transformation of the international system based on what happened. So we do have an opportunity here to work as researchers, those who are engaging policymakers, those who are working with international institutions to actually push this agenda. And I think this is the time to do it, because the window begins to close the more we move forward into time. So this global crisis of multilateralism, the collapse of the international system of collective security is a massive gap. And if we don't find ways to plug that hole, at least to visualize and vision what the future looks like, then I think we're going to struggle moving forward. I think very briefly on the African peace mission, it was for South Africa, a moment of stepping out and leading an initiative to St. Petersburg and Kiev. And it is placing South Africa on the international stage. We need to, as Africans, also analyze that much more deeply. And the reason I think it's important is that it does create a track if and when the opportunity presents itself. And this probably means without Putin in Moscow, there could be an opening there to move towards a more focused peacemaking process. Just to put that on the table, that is not a wasted initiative, and we need to keep looking into that and analyzing that initiative. So I think I'll stop there, and looking forward to the discussions and the questions and the comments later on. Thank you.